Hi, I'm Mark Gibson and this is my presentation for DES313. I'm going to be showing my prototype for my player experience goal, which I centered around loss aversion and some of its applications. I created a board game from research, recurring features, and what I perceived as best practices from board games and video games that reflects the experience goal I hope to achieve. What is loss aversion? Jeffrey Engelstein condensed the meaning of loss aversion into a simple statement in his 2020 book, Achievement Relocked, Loss Aversion and Game Design, to losing something makes you feel worse than gaining the same thing makes you feel good. I have chosen to focus on three of the applications of loss aversion. Endowment effect. When an object is yours, it is given psychological value over an equivalent object that is not yours. Framing. Whether something can be manipulated to be seen as a gain or a loss. And endowed progress. The reluctancy to abandon a partially completed goal, even one forced upon the player. Putting this into practice, I wanted to use the loss aversion's influence on a player's perception of risk and reward, decision making and motivation to have them create an attachment to something within a game, and then have them put that something at risk. The risk I always knew I was going to have was separating the feeling of putting something at risk and the association with gambling. Loss aversion and gambling are interwoven with each other sadly, and I tried my best to separate the two through my design choices throughout. As a quick overview, the board game. Each player has 10 crop pieces, a farmer and a farm sheet. The first player to get all 10 of their crops into the farm area is the winner. Each round, players draw raccoon cards and move their farmer down the numbered board towards the raccoon, the number of spaces equal to the card they just drew. The aim being to be the one closest to the raccoon each round without landing on it. Players can choose to draw a card or stay where they are at any point in the round. If a player does reach the raccoon, the player loses one crop to the raccoon's stash, and all other players gain one crop to their farm. Making an attachment early in the game was vital. Druvelis and Sonneman's 2015 paper, The Endowment Effect in Games, states that there is considerable evidence to support the existence of the endowment effect in relation to an individual's decision making. Through the research I had gathered in games such as Portal and Pokemon, I found that players were able to form psychological attachments with inanimate objects if they are given meaning and or character, and by limiting the choice that a player has when that choice is made, it is given more value. This influenced my decision in giving my game a theme, as I required whimsical yet relatable items for players to choose from. The first step in playing the game is getting players to choose a crop. They choose from the golden potatoes, the hot pink chilies, the purple carrots, or the bright green broccoli. Having players make a choice at this stage, rather than just be given an item, makes that item more valuable to the player than any other player's items. As found in my research of Monopoly, players will hoard what they perceive as valuable, so the players will do all they can to hold on to that valuable thing for as long as they can. I designed the farm space to be named by each player. This, again, was to give ownership and value to an item through the endowment effect. Although not in the same context, the Pokemon Nuzlocke part of my research influenced this part of my design. When looking into the endowment effect and how players' choices affect their gameplay, getting players to form those psychological attachments to the game items was key. Now that the players have set up their farms, the round can begin. Players have a corresponding farmer that matches the colour of their crop that they will move along the board as they draw cards. The cards are a standard 52 card deck size, but I designed new card faces in place of the originals. The designs are numbered 1 through 10, omitting the aces, face cards and suits. There are 4 of each 1 through 9 and 16 10 cards. This was to increase the chances of players having to risk taking another card, as they were unable to reach 21 in only 2 cards. The probability of them reaching 20 or at least into the high teens is fairly possible in 2 cards, but if all the players do that, then they are likely to want to risk drawing another card. The beginning of the game starts with players having 2 crops each in the farm space, and the other 8 in the raccoon stash area. Nunez and Dreze's 2006 paper, The Endowed Progress Effect, How Artificial Advancement Increases Effort, where the famous car wash study took place, explains that people tend to think more about an incomplete task than a completed one. This is called the Zeigarnik effect. The board game Catan does this exact same thing with its point system also. By giving players the goal of getting 10 crops back to their field and giving them 2 as a starting point, the player feels as if the task has been started for them, and it is now incomplete, rather than starting with 0 crops and framing it as not yet started. The same Jeffrey Engelstein as before created a board game called Pit Crew, where he implemented framing as part of his playtesting into the point system. Using the same process as he did, I reframed the losing to everyone else gaining. When a player draws too many raccoons and unfortunately reaches the big raccoon on the board, they will lose one crop, but all other players will also gain one crop back from their raccoon stash. This not only speeds up the game, allowing it to feel less like a grind for the players to win, but also reframing the loss for one player into a win for the others. In theory, this was a great idea, and it did what I intended in practice also, but as more than one player reached the raccoon per round, and perhaps only one player was left on the board, that player gained multiple points. This is both a gain and a loss on my part, as that player is very happy with the outcome, but there is definitely balance issues if this was to be taken further. Because the players were, in essence, playing blackjack, I needed to reframe the game to stop players from getting into that casino mindset. As mentioned in my research, there is evidence that links loss aversion and gambling, and I did not want to associate the whimsical farm-themed board game I had envisioned too closely with actual gambling. I did this by changing the numbers from a counting up to system to a counting down to system, with the idea of going bust being reframed as reaching the raccoons. Players not holding onto their cards, discarding them immediately, and showing them to other players, as well as moving a piece along a board to signify they just drew. All the while not using actual playing cards, I felt I managed to disassociate the game from the traditional casino-style blackjack game. I tried to keep the rules of the game fairly simple, as not to overload the players. Keeping cognitive load in mind, I made sure to implement a short game loop, keep to a maximum of 3 items the player had to deal with at any time throughout the game, and because it was turn-based, the player's attention was never divided. I implemented Gestalt principles into my design as best I could throughout, focusing on continuity on the play area and proximity on the cards, as well as similarity throughout my entire design. Object affordance played a much larger role than I first thought until I started playtesting. Due to the tangibility of the game pieces, the boards and the cards, the players immediately began placing pieces in and around the spaces and knew the numbers on the cards and the boards were linked. I feel that the motivation part of perception within my prototype design was a success. Due to the short game loop, players never had to wait long for their turn to come around again, and when it did, the feeling of will I or won't I draw a card loomed over them as they approached the raccoon. I hoped that this short game loop would allow for the overall game to be somewhat fast paced, allowing the game to be played multiple times after each other, holding out for good retention. I feel I implemented implicit, intrinsic and extrinsic motivations some way throughout, trying to get ahead of the other players without going over, having the crops waiting to be collected as a reward for winning a round, and having an interesting theme that players buy into by naming their farm. All this, and keeping the players' motivational attention on more than one thing, while their working memory was only ever focused on the task at hand. Throughout my playtests, players had become attached to their crops, and were highly adverse to losing them. As my participants may have been biased, I'll have 2 conclusions. This may be a success due to my successful research and implementation of the endowment effect and endow progress, or this may be because people just don't like losing things that they perceive as theirs. Either way, I feel I created an experience where players became adverse to losing something they perceived as having greater value compared to other players. In saying that, there are changes I would make that I would think would improve the overall game feel. Having players move raccoon pieces towards a farm space instead of farmers towards the raccoons. This would build more tension as players have become more invested in the welfare of their farm as the raccoons are actively coming towards them. Implementing a rule that players must reach a certain space before they can stay, ramping up the risk factor for players and stopping them from staying back in the hopes that other players will go bust. Things I would do differently in reflection. I would try to implement my research on loss aversion into a single player video game rather than a multiplayer board game. Much like the Companion Cube in Portal or the Nuzlocke challenge in the Pokemon franchise, giving players a companion that they can build an attachment to and that can be lost throughout the journey would have a much greater impact on the players emotionally. I feel this would build on the applications of loss aversion over time, increasing the psychological value to the player rather than expecting them to have an immediate connection to something they had just picked up moments ago. However, I do feel I successfully expressed the player experience goal I hope to achieve, by implementing the applications of loss aversion into a game design that justified my research topics. Thank you very much for listening to my DES313 presentation.